And as we read, let's keep in mind that because this whole program of action is founded upon one alcoholic working with another, and because we can help when nobody else can, and we have a responsibility and a mission to do exactly that. Remember, our 12-step is quite clear about this. We carry this message to other alcoholics. And in the big book itself, the message is even broader than that we're to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. And when Bill first wrote the 12-step, he had written, we'll carry this message to others, especially alcoholics. This being so, these pages are very, very important to us because they demonstrate for us how we fulfill a large part of this requirement, this mission we have to carry the message. And remember that in order for us to be successful in carrying the message, we need to have somebody there with us who's paying attention, who wants to know what we have to say and is willing to listen, and who we can reach out to, so that the person has more than a curiosity, but really begins to identify themselves with us. And to do that, it's necessary for us to let them know how we drink. And we don't hold back on that. We tell them about our drinking and what alcohol did to us and how we tried to stop and were not able to stop. And we tell them about the treatment centers or the detoxes or the hospitals or the jails or the lost jobs or the lost families. We tell them exactly what the consequences of our drinking were, so that they can begin to see that we know what we're talking about, that we're not just another moralizer or a do-gooder, but that we truly have a message which they need to hear, because we've been there before them and they can identify themselves with us. And so one of the things that we know we have to do is we have to make sure they understand what's wrong with them. Now, Dr. Silkworth made this real clear to Bill. He said, looking back on his experience with Bill, he said that in the second time that Bill was in his hospital before he left, Dr. Silkworth had told his wife Lois that he couldn't do anything for Bill, and that he was going to die or go crazy if he didn't stop drinking, and he might have a year. But the bad news was that Bill couldn't stop on his own, and Dr. Silkworth had no remedy for that. Bill was one of the guys that, had he not had a home to go to, Silkworth would have consigned to the hopeless ward, which, by the way, was where Bill and the others found most of their prospects after Bill got sober and began to build a fellowship in New York. And he said, you got to let them know what's wrong with him. He said, I believe that when I told Lois that, and she repeated that to you, that this was the sledgehammer you needed to wake you up to the fact that there was something beyond all of your miseries and all of the misery you caused others and your failures in life, and what was beyond that was insanity and death. So he said, you're going to have to let them know what's wrong with them. And so that's one of the things which we studied last week. Oh, I beg your pardon, we haven't reached that yet. Well, that's good, because I wanted to do that today anyway. Now, last week, remember that we found out that we needed to get the person alone if possible. No mob scenes, please. Remember, this is a one-on-one program. At its base, at its essence, it is still one alcoholic working with another. That's how it was founded, and that's what works best. In my experience, the very most that have been able to break that rule would to co-sponsor somebody, and That happened with me. I was co-sponsored by two very powerful gentlemen. And in the past, I've worked that way with a few people with whom I saw eye to eye on the program and on how to teach the steps and how the steps are to be worked, so that there would be no confusion. We try to find out as much about them as we can. We need some sort of basic stuff, like are they religious, they go to church, are they married, they got kids, they work, what do they do for a living? One was, have they been in hospitals or detoxes? Have they been to jail? Are they working now? Basic stuff. How old are they? And once having done that, we'll go to the top of page 92, or bottom of page 91. When he sees you know all about the drinking game, commence to describe yourself as an alcoholic. Tell him how baffled you were, how you finally learned that you were sick. Give him an account of the struggles you made to stop. Show him the mental twist which leads to the first drink of a spree. We suggest you do this as we have done it in the chapter on alcoholism. You remember in Fred's story, when we were reading that story together, Fred referred to those strange mental blank spots. And remember, he had a perfect day, nothing was wrong. He went back to the hotel, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, it seemed appropriate to have a cocktail before dinner. And he never thought any more about it, even though he had made mighty resolves never to drink again. And he had convinced himself he knew so much about alcohol and alcoholism, and he would never drink again. Well, he said he kind of blanked out. None of that came to him. None of his fears of what he might lose or the approbation he might suffer as a result of it. Strange mental blank spots. We suggest you do this as we've done it in chapter on alcoholism, which is chapter 3. If he's alcoholic, he will understand you at once. He will match your mental inconsistencies with some of his own. Now, this is where we begin the process of identification, and we begin to establish our credibility with this person. See, that's critical. Remember, last week I think we discussed this. Bill had no problem with Evie in believing Evie, because he knew Evie was a drunk. He'd been drinking with him for 20 years. So when Evie told him that he was sober and that he had found religion and that he was staying sober and he'd found a way to stay sober, Bill had to listen, because he knew that Evie knew what he was talking about. If you are satisfied that he's a real alcoholic, begin to dwell on the hopeless feature of the malady. Show him from your own experience how the queer mental conditions surrounding the first drink prevents normal functioning of the willpower. A lot of what it's saying here might not work with someone whose primary problem was drugs. If it's a true double addiction or whatever, they probably understand what you're saying, because alcohol has them by the throat too. Sometimes we have to wait till they've taken their first step before we can really help them. But I don't know if there's anything that can be done about it. This is the way it is today. You might want to take a look at page 23, however, or 22, I should say. What I think this will teach us that we can't simply ignore people who have a problem with alcohol but have also had a problem with drugs. On page 22, 5 lines down, as matters grow worse, he begins to use a combination of high-powered sedative and liquor to quiet his nerves and go to work. Then comes a day when he simply cannot make it and gets drunk all over again. Perhaps he goes to a doctor who gives him morphine or some sedative with which to taper off, then begins to appear at hospitals and sanitariums. So apparently there was a lot of drugs involved even back when the big book was being written. Whether one would call it a dual addiction or not, I have great problems with these diagnoses that people are saddled with when they come in here. And a lot of times that diagnosis is something that they believe, and they won't shake it. And it's hard to get past that because we start talking alcohol, and they want to talk dual addiction, and that's because that's what they've been led to believe is their problem. What I found is that with many people, I'm able to convince them, because it's true, that the steps work for everybody. So the real problem is, how do you get somebody properly motivated to do the kind of work necessary and to be as honest with themselves as is required in order to work steps? Because the program of 12 steps is not for sissies. It requires a lot of courage to face ourselves. And sometimes I think the more important thing we supply in the beginning is motivation and the hope that we can supply that if these steps are followed, that they too will recover. Now, I've never seen the steps fail, regardless of what particular problem the person may have. The failure is most often is at the beginning. Now, you're absolutely right, because we're talking here about working with somebody brand new. And this chapter focuses on the alcoholic. And in terms of establishing rapport with them and establishing our credibility, it is our story of our alcoholism which was depended upon to break through. So I think you'll also find this, that there are so many parallels between what happens to people, even though they may be dually addicted with drugs or alcohol, and what's happened to us, that they will be able to find themselves in that story somewhere. And maybe that's all that's necessary. So I would suggest that we not back away or disclaim any ability to be helpful, but that rather we try to be helpful and see what happens. And after all, the results of all of this are left up to God anyway, aren't they? Because ultimately we don't have any power one way or another to get somebody sober. So it may be that we're going to assume that God got them here. God expects us to follow directions and tell our story and leave the results up to Him. And when we do that, it's surprising how many people will pop around. I think if we have a negative attitude toward it right from the get-go, we probably lose any effectiveness we might have. Okay. If you're satisfied he's a real alcoholic, begin to dwell on the hopeless feature of the malady. Now, that's not explained here, but it's explained elsewhere. Hopeless feature means this. It's very simple. Go back to basics. I'm an alcoholic, and alcoholism is a deadly, incurable illness. If I don't stop drinking, I will go mad or die. But I'm powerless over alcohol, and therefore I can't stop drinking. So therefore, I'm doomed to die. That's the hopeless side of the equation. Now, the hope comes out, of course, with the method of recovery set forth in this book. But we're first going to hit them with the hopelessness of their situation left uncorrected. Untreated alcoholism is invariably fatal. We dwell on the hopeless feature of the malady. Show him from your own experience how the queer mental conditions surrounding that first drink prevents normal functioning of the willpower. Don't at this stage refer to this book unless he has seen it and wishes to discuss it. And be careful not to brand him as an alcoholic. Let him draw his own conclusion. If he sticks to the idea he can still control his drinking, tell him that possibly he can if he's not too alcoholic, but insist that if he's severely afflicted, there may be little chance he can recover by himself. So we're avoiding any kind of hysterical stuff here. And remember what Dr. Silkworth said in his opinion, that what will interest alcoholic people is not frothy emotional appeal, but something that has substance and weight, which is what we're trying to bring here to this conversation. Continue to speak of alcoholism as an illness, a fatal malady. Talk about the conditions of body and mind which accompany it. Keep his attention focused mainly on your personal experience. Explain that many are doomed who never realize their predicament. Doctors are rightly loath to tell alcoholic patients the whole story unless it will serve some good purpose. But you may talk to him about the hopelessness of alcoholism because you offer a solution. Now here's the turning point in the conversation. You will soon have your friend admitting he has many, if not all, the traits of the alcoholic. And by the way, this would be true whether the person is considered himself or herself to be purely alcoholic or duly addicted. So many of the same traits are going to show up regardless of what the diagnosis turns out to be. You will soon have your friend admitting he has many, if not all, of the traits of the alcoholic. If his own doctor is telling him that he's alcoholic, so much the better. Even though your protege may not have entirely admitted his condition, he's become very curious to know how you got well. Let him ask that question, if you will. Now here's the third part of the formula which is being presented to us here, which goes this way. First, we tell our story. Then we talk about alcoholism as a disease, stressing the hopeless feature. And the third part is now we're going to tell them how we recovered. So you see, we built it up to the point where the hopelessness is now quite apparent. You're going to die if you don't stop drinking, and you can't stop. So that's the problem. Then how did I recover? Now, this is where that part of this scenario comes into play. Now we're going to tell them how we recovered. Let him ask you that question, if you will. Tell him exactly what happened to you. Stress the spiritual feature freely. You should underline that if you're underlining in your book. Let me tell you why. This is the first meeting with this person, isn't it? And all around these rooms, you keep hearing people talk about, oh, don't say anything about God to newcomer. You're going to chase them away, and all that stuff. I've heard people over and over again get up here and say, if anybody had mentioned God to me the first day I was here, I'd have walked out. It's almost politically correct these days to say that. And yet the big book is telling us something which ought to be entirely obvious. If you and I are going to tell someone else how we recovered, what are we going to substitute for God? The group? We're going to tell them that we recovered using group therapy? Or are we going to tell them we recovered because we had a wonderful psychiatrist or a great facilitator? Or because are we going to tell them we recovered because we just didn't drink, but we kept going to meetings? When none of that's true. We recovered because we got on that path that God can and will if we seek Him. And we've been on the path of seeking God. And that's how we recovered. And to do that, we worked the 12 steps. Now, if I'm going to tell you, and you're brand new, how I recovered, am I going to lie to you? How am I going to cover up the truth that God is in the equation all the way through. Remember, we're going to ask him to read the book, and the book is going to display for him or her the 12 steps. Where do we find God in the steps? Right up there in the second step, don't we? And again in the third step, and the fifth step, and the seventh step, and the 10th step, and the 11th step. And so, aren't we caught out in our lie almost immediately? How do we discuss our recovery in terms other than the big book and God? If somebody, for example, tells you this is what you ought to be doing, you ask them, gee, thank you for that. Where's that in the big book? Or where's God in that equation? If it's not in the book and God's not there, I would suggest strongly to you, you can safely ignore it. So tell him exactly what happened to you and stress the spiritual freely. If a man be agnostic or atheist, make it emphatic that he does not have to agree with your conception of God. Notice that you have this tells you you've already talked about God, haven't you? But now you're telling me you don't have to agree with my conception of God. You can choose any conception you like, provided it makes sense to you. The main thing is that he be willing to believe in a power greater than himself and that he live by spiritual principles. Now, we've been all over this all the way through this book up to this point. Remember, this all starts back in Bill's story. What was it that turned the thing around for Bill? Remember when he had worked his first step, it was clear to him that he was powerless and he was an alcoholic and he was licked, he was beaten. But he was having great difficulty with the idea of a higher power, God, until Ebby said to him, Bill, you don't have to accept my conception of God or anybody else's. Your conception is all you need to get started. And by the way, the only thing that's required is that you be willing to believe that there just might be a power out there greater than yourself. This is what turned the corner for Bill. And of course, these two rules were repeated 4 times in chapter 4. It's clear. And here we're being told right up front with the new person, if it becomes an issue, let them know right away that his conception of God or her conception of God is going to be all that's required. And that the only real important thing here is that she or he be willing to believe there just might be a power, and that they be willing to live by spiritual principles, that that's all that's required. So you can see that right at the beginning of the relationship with this new person, the big book is instructing us, get right to it. Tell them how the cow ate the cabbage. This is the way I recovered. This is what I did. The 12 steps that I use for recovery are spiritual steps, and I must seek a higher power. And I've done that, and it's worked for me, and I believe if you're an alcoholic like I am, it'll work for you too. Going on, when dealing with such a person, you'd better use everyday language to describe spiritual principles. There's no use in arousing any prejudice he may have against certain theological terms and conceptions about which he may already be confused. Don't raise such issues, no matter what your own convictions are. This is a blank appeal to us not to inject our own religious values, that is, those things which come from our religious beliefs as opposed to spiritual beliefs, because this could be quite dangerous, and it also is something which AA does not engage in, since we're not a religion and we accept the We accept members from any religion or no religion at all. So we stay away from theological terms. There's kind of a backhanded way of saying, don't try to get this guy or this gal to come to church with you and find Jesus, or end up down at the Catholic Church and get converted, or go down to the shul and become a Jew. Because this is the way that I recovered. We're going to stay completely away from that stuff. Certain theological terms and conceptions. Now, your prospect may belong to a religious denomination. His religious education training may be far superior to yours. In that case, he's going to wonder how you can add anything to what he already knows. But he will be curious to learn why his own convictions have not worked, and why yours seem to work so well. He may be an example of the truth that faith alone is insufficient. Is that ever a powerful statement? And you know, it's so easy to just slip right on by that one. Faith alone is not sufficient. Don't we learn over and over again in this book that faith without works is dead? Now, when we talk about the works that it must accompany faith, what are we talking about? We're talking about the 12 steps. We're talking about carrying the message. We're talking about being of maximum service to God and the people about us. We're talking about fitting ourselves to be of maximum service. He may be an example of the truth that faith alone is insufficient. Now, faith alone may be quite sufficient for most purposes, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking here about recovery from the disease of alcoholism, which is a disease bottomed on the fact that we are spiritually bankrupt, living in self and practicing constantly, daily, being God. And we've got defects of character over which we have no power, which are blocking us from God. So this is a highly complex and very serious dilemma that we're in here. And it is not enough for us, or any alcoholic for that matter, no matter what denomination or how carefully they practice their religion. More has to happen. To be vital, faith must be accompanied by self-sacrifice and unselfish, constructive action. Faith without works is dead. This goes right back to what Bill said in his story. Remember that if the alcoholic fails to enlarge and perfect his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he cannot survive the certain low spots ahead, and he'll drink again. And this question of self-sacrifice runs all the way through our big book and through our steps. It also runs all the way through our traditions. The 12th tradition, by the way, is a tradition based upon self-sacrifice, not fear. It doesn't really have anything to do with anonymity as a requirement centered around our fears of being found out. Anonymity in the 12th tradition has to do with self-sacrifice. And so, as we go through this, remember how consistent this book has been all the way through up to this point. It never changes. The things that we learned back in the first couple of chapters are resounding here. We're getting the additional overtones and the echoes from those things. Let him see that you're not there to instruct him in religion. Admit that he probably knows more about it than you do. But call to his attention the fact that however deep his faith and knowledge, he could not have applied it or he would not drink. Underline applied it, because applied is an action word, isn't it? Put it to use. Put your faith to use. Use your faith. Do works. And that's what the 12 steps are, guys. if we can just get that one message clearly settled between us, the 12 steps are the application of faith. They are the steps that we take to express our faith. First to gain faith and then to express it. And by following those 12 steps, we will be constantly applying our faith and our knowledge. And remember, in the 10th step, we learned that we had to continue doing these things for our lifetime, and that by doing that, we were going to increase our understanding and effectiveness, which is, you remember we talked about this, that means understanding of God, the God of my understanding, the development of my faith, the experiencing of God working in my life, and effectiveness in carrying the message. That's what that little phrase means. He could not have applied his faith and knowledge, or he would not drink. Now, see what a neat sentence that is? Because you turn that around, what's it saying? If he had applied his faith and his knowledge, he would not drink. And that's what we're asking him to do with us. Perhaps your story will help him see where he's failed to practice the very precepts he knows so well. Check your own memory. You've been to church, the preacher or the rabbi or the priest has come down with a hard-hitting sermon, and everything he said applied to you in one way or another. You thought, yeah, he's right. Politically correct, she's right. And boy, I got to do that. And an hour after you leave the church, if you're thinking about it, you say, well, that's all great. I want to be that way, but how do I do it? What do I do to be that? You see, that's why the 12 steps work, because we know what to do. We've been given those same principles as steps of action. And when we do the work of the steps, we practice those principles in all of our affairs. And that's the way we live our lives. We represent no particular faith or denomination. We are dealing only with general principles common to most denominations. Which means, please, let's stay free of all religious symbology, of all things which are only common to certain sects or they are sectarian beliefs or practices. Things like sin and deadly sin and prayers which are sectarian prayers and all of the things which go to make up a particular religious point of view. We need to stay away from those. We are not a religion, and every time we indulge in that kind of stuff, we're bound to put off people who do not believe that way, have never been taught that way, and don't want to believe that way, and we're asking them to believe as we believe, and yet we are telling them, on the one hand, we don't practice a religion here. On the other hand, we are loading them up with religious concepts. That is, concepts of a particular religion. I'm going to speak a little softer, so listen carefully. If you can't hear me, come up to the front. Outline the program of action, explaining how you made a self-appraisal. 4th step, how you straightened out your past. The 9th step, and why you're now endeavoring to be helpful to him, because I must carry the message. Work and self-sacrifice for others is the answer to long-term sobriety. It is important for him to realize that your attempt to pass this on to him plays a vital part in your own recovery. Actually, he may be helping you more than you're helping him. Make it plain he's under no obligation to you, but you hope only that he will try to help other alcoholics when he escapes his own difficulties. So just how important it is that he place the well for other people ahead of his own. Make it clear that he's not under pressure, that he needn't see you again if he doesn't want to. You should not be offended if he wants to call it off, for he's helped you more than you've helped him. Isn't that amazing? That's one of the paradoxes. Here we set out to be helpful to others without seeking anything in return, and yet what we get in return is far greater than we give. If your talk has been sane, quiet, and full of human understanding, you have perhaps made a friend. Maybe you've disturbed him about the question of alcoholism. This is all to the good. Listen to this now. The more hopeless he feels, the better. He'll be more likely to follow your suggestions. Dr. Silkworth talked to Bill quite often about using a sledgehammer on them. Just beat them down. Make sure they understand that this is life and death matter. Your candidate may give reasons why he need not follow all the program. He may rebel at the thought of a drastic house cleaning which requires discussion with other people. Do not contradict such views. Tell him you once felt as he does, but you doubt whether you would have made much progress had you not taken action. On your first visit, tell him about the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. If he shows interest, lend him your copy of this book. Now here's really the fourth part of this scenario. Remember, we told him about ourselves, we told him about the disease, we told him how we recovered, and now we tell him a little bit about the fellowship. How we have meetings and how it's kind of like how it's organized, just probably a thumbnail sketch. Unless your friend wants to talk further about himself, do not wear out your welcome. Give him a chance to think it over. If you do stay, let him steer the conversation any direction he likes. Sometimes a new man is anxious to proceed at once, and you may be tempted to let him do so. This is sometimes a mistake. If he has trouble later, he's likely to say you rushed him. Now right here, this is a watershed point here, and it's real important for us to understand what he's saying. So many times, and a lot of you have been around a long time, so you know what I'm talking about, a new person will come up to you, and they want you to start taking them to the steps right away. Or they want to rush into getting something done. And you've talked to them, and you found out they haven't read the book. Now, it's very, very, very important that somebody who's new read the book. And this is where it all has to start. Read on here and we'll see how that works. You'll be most successful with alcoholics if you do not exhibit any passion for crusade or reform. Never talk down to an alcoholic from any moral or spiritual hilltop. Simply lay out the kit of spiritual tools for his inspection. Now this is the second place in the big book where the simple kit of spiritual tools is mentioned. Anybody remember where the first place is? You'll find it in chapter 2. Talks about that simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. All we have to do is pick it up. You'll find that on page 25. And here we find it again. And simply lay out the kit of spiritual tools for his inspection. Show him how they worked with you. Boy, this is pretty important, isn't it? See, we're at this point now, we're saying, okay, here's what we do. And let me tell you how this worked for me. First I had to take a look to see what was wrong with me, because I really didn't know. And there's an inventory we take, we call our 4-step. And in that we find out what it is that's gone wrong with us and what our present reality is. It's not, we don't do this to make ourselves bad people, but to find out what needs to be corrected, where we're going to need God's help. And then I talked to somebody about all of this, and then I asked God for help with the things that I found that were wrong. And then where I saw that I'd hurt people or I owed amends of some kind, I would make those amends, and I did that. And since then, every day, I do a little inventory, and I do quite a bit of praying and meditating, and I get to a meeting, and I try to help somebody like you. And I do this every day. And this is the way I use these tools, and they work for me. And I've been sober a long time. And I recommend them to you because I know that they'll work for you too. Show him how they worked with you. Offer him friendship and fellowship. Tell him that if he wants to get well, you will do anything to help. And mean it when you say it. If he's not interested in your solution, if he expects you to act only as a banker for his financial difficulties or a nurse for his sprees, you may have to drop him until he changes his mind. This he may do after he gets hurt some more. Okay. A lot of times we're gonna have to just back off. On the following page, to follow through on this particular thought, let's just skip over there for a second. On top of page 96, do not be discouraged if your prospect does not respond at once. Search out another alcoholic and try again. You're sure to find someone desperate enough to accept with eagerness what you offer. We find it a waste of time to keep chasing a man who cannot or will not work with you. If you leave such a person alone, he may soon become convinced that he cannot recover by himself. Spend too much time on any one situation is to deny some other alcoholic an opportunity to live and be happy. And there's a lot of misguided, I think, anyway, misguided emphasis on being kind and loving and never giving up and always. There's just so darn many people out there right now that are nothing but tire kickers. And they'll just eat your time alive if you let them. So there's a solution, and it's in the next paragraph on page 95. If he is sincerely interested and wants to see you again, ask him to read this book in the interval. The whole book. The whole book. After doing that, he must decide for himself whether he wants to go on. He should not be pushed or prodded by you, his wife, or his friends. If he is to find God, the desire must come from within. Resist the temptation to hurry things along or to be a modern sponsor and say, well, just read the first couple of chapters and then we'll get going. Because you know, if you think about it, that the big book was written for this newcomer. It has very specific purposes in mind. One of those is that this newcomer suffers from a disease which is a disease of denial. And it's very, very important that the new person have come to a place where he or she completely identifies themselves with alcoholics. And the big book allows them to do that by virtue not only of what we find in the first 164 pages, but all the stories in the back of the book. Back there, this new person is going to find himself or herself. Once, twice, maybe several times. And these are stories of real people who are telling exactly what happened to them. So it's not a bunch of made-up stuff. These are not allegories. This is not a fable. This is not Uncle Remus or Aesop. This is real stuff. Real histories of real people. And they're telling exactly what happened to them and how they drank and how it affected them and how they tried to stop. And they're talking about how they finally were able to recover by using the program. So and there's stuff back there that he or she not going to find anywhere in the first part of the book. Some of the stories are the only place that some material even appears in this book. But even beyond that, if somebody is truly serious and they really want recovery, you tell them to read the book. And you'll find out soon enough how serious they are. So, and here's the rule now. If he is sincerely interested, not trying to fulfill some obligation down at his treatment center that said you have to have a sponsor before you graduate and some of that kind of stuff. Sincerely interested and wants to see you again. You could add a little phrase in here. You can find out for sure if this is true by asking him to read this book in the interval. After doing that, he must decide for himself whether he wants to go on. He should not be pushed or prodded by you, his wife, or his friends. Now here's the rule. If he is to find God, the desire must come from within. We can't open up his head and pour it in. It's got to come from within. It's got to come to him as a gift. If he's really here by God's grace and in God's time and in God's direction, this is going to work. If he's here because he was forced in here, he doesn't want to be here, he's only going through the motions, you're going to find out soon enough. So we back away, like in everything else that we do what it says right up to this point, all this stuff. Now we leave the results up to God. Back off and let God have his way. If he thinks he can do the job in some other way or prefers some other spiritual approach, encourage him to follow his own conscience. We have no monopoly on God, obviously. We merely have an approach that worked with us. Now, the word merely there is a slip of the pen, Bill. You should never have used that word. Most people will pass right over it, but the word mere or merely is a lot of content. It is a diminutive. It implies that there's not much to this, but that we have this mirror program. It just sort of happened to work for us, so we thought we'd write a book about it. Well, that's not it at all. We take the word merely out, and then we have the truth. We have an approach that worked with us. Therefore, that teaches us again what this big book is, the history. The history of the people who wrote the book and how they recovered. And they're telling us precisely what they did to recover. And the real message is that they believe absolutely that if we do as they did, that we too will recover, and they're right. It's exactly what happens. But point out that we alcoholics have much in common and that you would like in any case to be friendly. Let it go at that. Go down to 5 lines above the end of that paragraph. One of our fellowship failed entirely with his first half-dozen prospects. That was Bill. He often says that if he had continued to work on them, he might have deprived many others who have since recovered of their chance. And that's the truth. Now here's a very interesting paragraph. Again, among other things, the big book is talking here about time limits. Remember, everything that we'd studied up to this point took place in the first conversation. Then we gave him the book, told him to read the book. Now he's read the book. Suppose you are making your second visit to a man. He's read this volume and says he's prepared to go through with the 12 steps of the program of recovery. He wants what you have and is willing to go to any lengths to get it. Therefore, he is ready to take certain steps. We read that every day in chapter 5, don't we? Having had the experience yourself, you can give him much practical advice. Let him know you're available if he wishes to make a decision and tell a story. Now, this is consistent with what Bill wrote just a little earlier on when he was talking about that what we needed to do was to, or what he had done. Page 94, you'll see the same stuff now. Top of page 94, first full paragraph. Outline the program of action. Explain how you made a self-appraisal, how you straightened out your past, and why you're now endeavoring to be helpful to him. So we go back over here on page 96. Let him know you're available if he wishes to make a decision and tell his story. So what he's really saying here is that the essence of the program is in this decision, which is the decision of the third step, to turn my life and my will over to the care of God as I understand Him, and the commitment to go forward, which is centered around the fifth step, telling life story. You got to remember, when the book was written, there hadn't been much in the way at that point of formal 4 steps. The formal 4 steps that Bill outlines in the steps and in chapter 5 was something that was just getting started at the time he wrote the big book. Their MO prior to that time was basically like something like this. Dr. Bob would find some guy, a newcomer, get him up in his study on a Wednesday afternoon, and they would go through the steps on Wednesday afternoon. And what would happen there was that the newcomer would tell Bob his whole story. There used to be a story, and it was on 292, but that's been changed. I don't know what the page is now. I know it's in here. Where
he sold himself short.
Huh?
He sold himself short. They got a list of complete deflation.
Oh yeah, that's the story.
And
what page is that on?
well, in the third edition, it's on 292, like you said.
Yeah.
And there's a list of 6 things that he.
Well, let's find out where it is, because there's a little bit more to it than that.
Yeah. The name
Okay, that's on 258.
in the 4th edition.
In the 4th edition, 292 in the 3rd edition. Now let's see where we find this stuff. Okay, if you have 4th edition, go to page 262. Now this is typical of what was going on in the early days. Bottom of page 262. The day before I was due to go back to Chicago, it was Dr. Bob's afternoon off, and he had me to the office, and we spent 3 or 4 hours formally going through the 6-step program as it was at that time. The 6 steps were: 1, complete deflation; 2, dependence and guidance from a higher power; 3, moral inventory; 4, confession; 5, restitution; and 6, continued work with other alcoholics. Dr. Bob led me through all these steps. At the moral inventory, he brought up several of my bad personality traits or character defects, such as selfishness, conceit, jealousy, carelessness, intolerance, ill temper, sarcasm, and resentments. We went over these at great length, and then he finally asked if I wanted these defects of character removed. When I said yes, we both knelt at his desk and prayed, each of us asking these defects taken away. Now, if you have any doubt that the 6th step follows the 5th step immediately, here is proof positive that even in the days before the 6th step and the 7th step were separated, the 6th step was a gift. It was, you found out in the 5th step. You ready to have this stuff taken away? Yeah. Okay, let's get on our knees and ask God to do it. But notice that this was all done in an afternoon. So when we look here on page 96, let's go back to that now so we can understand what's being said here. Let him know you're available if he wishes to make a decision and tell his story, but do not insist upon it if he prefers to consult someone else. What's the message here? He's read the book. At the second meeting, he said, I'm ready. I've read the book. I want what you have. I'm willing to do anything to get it. I'm ready to do these steps. Do you say to him, don't worry about it, son. I'll let you know when you're ready. Just don't go to meetings and don't drink. Take him immediately to the steps. Period. It's so clear, isn't it? And all this other stuff is balderdash and gobbledygook and God knows what else you want to put on it. How soon do you want to get well? And are you willing to sit around with untreated alcoholism, praying and hoping against hope that you don't get drunk again? Those are pretty good questions, aren't they? How important is your spirit, your soul, your life? Is it worth saving? Are you satisfied that if you have to end up on the scrap heap of life, that'll be just fine? Or do you want to do something about it? Oh, you want to do something, but when do you plan to do that? Well, my sponsor says that I don't even get cleared up in my head for 5 years. My sponsor said that I have to stay sober for a year before we can start on the steps. My sponsor said I'm only going to work 1 step a year. My sponsor said it doesn't matter how I work the steps as long as I do it. My sponsor said we're only going to work 1 step a month. My sponsor said I have to go to meetings for 90 days to prove that I'm serious, and then she'll tell me whether I'm ready or not. And this goes on and on and on. My sponsor gave me a list of 695 questions to answer in longhand, told me I would have 2 months to do it. You know, I get a hell of a lot more upset about this kind of nonsense than I ever do about dual addiction. I found out that people who have diagnosed dually addicted, you approach them in the right way, if they decide they want to work the steps, they will recover. They will.